Bill, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Okay. I taught for many years at Huntington University in Huntington, Indiana. I've done quite a lot of writing, a lot of it in philosophy of religion, some in philosophy of mind and free will. I was editor of the journal Faith and Philosophy for 6 or 7 years. Published a few books, had a lot of fun doing philosophy, and I was really pleased that Tom invited me to this session. So I can tell you anything else you want to know, but that's a few basics about myself.
Awesome. I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe that all of the evidence seems to indicate naturalism as a better explanation than theism. Could you tell me some of the reasons that you would think theism is a better explanation than naturalism?
Well, I think that in my view, the best the best way to make a case for theism, it would be a combination of a variety of different arguments and considerations. Also, not unimportantly, I think, in fact, very importantly, I believe that many of us actually have an experience of God, an experience in which we relate personally to God and come to know God. That subject is a little bit hard to about, but it's an important part of my own belief, and I think for a great many other theists. However, I don't by any means back away from carrying on a philosophical discussion about theism. Now, in inviting me, you suggested we might focus on something that's come to be called the argument from reason. This is not so much an argument for theism as it is an argument against certain standard variety of naturalism. But for many people, I think many philosophically inclined people at least, theism and naturalism are the two main options, the two most viable options. So if naturalism takes a hit, that certainly is favorable to theism. But there are other arguments that we could go into, but I'll leave it to you how you would best like to start our discussion.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that naturalism and theism are probably the two major, biggest worldviews as far as I can see. And I would definitely count, if the argument from reason worked to show that there was something more than the natural world, I would count that as in some kind of favor of theism. From my perspective, I think that the natural world explains everything about reason. So what is the argument from reason, and how would that indicate a non-natural world?
Okay, well, let me just set it out, and at any point you can jump in and raise a question or disagree or whatever you want to do. We start out with the agreement that human beings are rational beings. Not wholly rational, there's a lot else to us besides that, but we do have both a natural desire and an ability to arrive at true knowledge about a good many things. And that's something that naturalism will certainly agree with, because naturalists put a lot of stock in our scientific knowledge of the natural world. Now, my contention is, and this is obviously something, naturalism cannot, in fact, provide an explanation of our nature as rational beings. But let me be clear about the kind of naturalism that this argument targets. If it's not the kind of naturalism you espouse, then we might end up arguing past each other. But naturalism has this picture of the whole universe as beginning with nothing but matter and energy, maybe from the Big Bang, or maybe there's something before the Big Bang or whatever. But there's this long story, much of which is scientifically verified, about how the universe as it is today originated from the beginning in matter and energy. Now, one assumption of the naturalism that I target is that mind is supervenient on the human being's body and brain. That is, the mind is not something off on its own, doing its own thing, like some dualists would say, but rather whatever mental thoughts and experiences we have is a consequence of our bodily state. Okay. A second conclusion that follows pretty closely from that is that the physical domain is causally closed. That is, there's nothing outside of the physical realm, nothing like God, for instance, or angels or whatever, nothing outside of the physical domain that exerts causal influences on the physical domain. It's, again, causally closed. All the explanations that there are of what goes on in the physical world are physical explanations. The third point that may be a little less common, a little less familiar, is the idea that the physical realm is mechanistic. Now, what I mean by that is that things that go on in the metaphysical world go on without reference to purposes or thoughts or ideas or anything non-physical. I need to say this because otherwise it becomes hard to explain what is the physical world, because certainly what we now know about physics is not the whole story. There will be probably additional particles, additional forces, and so on discovered in the future. And we can't know in advance just what those are. But to say that the physical realm is mechanistic is to say that whatever is in that science of the future, you will not have physical things being pushed around by purposes or responding to ideas, to thoughts. This is just not what physics is about. If we had a science that took account of those things, wouldn't be physics in any sense that we can understand it. So it seems to me that that's a reasonable stipulation about what can be allowed as physical. Okay, so again, we have the mind is supervenient on matter, the physical domain is causally closed, and third, the physical realm is mechanistic. Now, compare this with the situation of reason, the idea that humans are rational beings. I submit that in order to arrive at reasonable conclusions, in order to understand the world in a rational way, first we have to be motivated to arrive at truth. We have a desire to arrive at truth, and our success in doing that, arriving at truth, will very much depend on our desire. Scientists, for instance, are very strongly motivated to find out the truth about the domains that they're studying. Furthermore, our thinking has to be guided by principles of reasoning. These are formalized to some extent in logic and in scientific method and in lots of other ways that are complicated. But when we think well, our thinking is guided by principles of sound reasoning. Now, at the face of it, it looks like we have a contradiction. As we seek the truth, our thinking is motivated by the desire to find the truth about some matter, and it's guided by principles of reasoning. On the other hand, our thinking is simply the result of the operation of mechanistic physical laws that have no reference to motivation or desires or objectives or anything like that. And furthermore, these laws do not refer to mental content. As my friend Victor Robert likes to say, in an avalanche, the stones do not go where they go because it's a good idea for them to go there. All right, it's just a physical, brutal, mechanical process, and if you happen to be in the way, that's too bad. They don't deviate because it would be nice for you not to be buried by the avalanche. So it looks like there's a contradiction between the two. Now, you very likely have some way in mind that you can get out of that, and we can come back to that. But I want to make one further point before I stop for the moment. All this comes very much to a fine point when we ask, how did human beings become rational in the first place? Now, there's an answer to this that is, I think, invariably given by naturalists, one that has, on the face of it, a lot of plausibility. The answer is in terms of what we might call evolutionary epistemology. Okay? And the idea is this, that as life was developing on the earth, some creatures began to have some cognitive awareness of their surroundings. At the beginning, this was undoubtedly very primitive. Maybe microorganisms were aware that certain things in their environment signaled the presence of food, and other things signaled toxic substances, and so they learned to move toward the food and away from the toxic substances. That's a very simple starting point. But it turned out in many situations that having an awareness of what's going on in the environment was beneficial. Okay, the microorganism that tracked on food was more likely to survive and give rise to a lot of other microorganisms. And this happens all the way up. It happens with insects, it happens with fish, happens with birds, happens with mammals. At many stages, it turns out that having a better awareness of the environment is beneficial. And so the creatures that had that improved awareness did better in surviving and reproducing. And so we have smarter and smarter animals coming along. Now, I think that's extremely plausible, and at least in broad general terms, something a lot like that must have actually happened. But there's a problem, okay? Suppose we've got, let's say, a group of apes who are, eating some nuts or something, and a saber-toothed tiger shows up in the medium distance. Now, what are they going to do about that? Well, the apes have a nervous system that has been evolved through evolutionary epistemology, which tends to cause them to get out of the vicinity when they see a saber-toothed cat or some other predator coming. Maybe they climb a tree that the cat is unable to master. But their nervous system is, let's say, has developed so as to get them out of the situation that would lead them to become the cat's dinner. Okay, but of course, we think that these baboons also know that recognize that there's a saber-toothed cat out there. But the odd thing is that whatever their mental state, whatever their thoughts, whatever their conscious mental state may be, has no effect whatsoever on their behavior, okay? The behavior is controlled by the physical reactions in their body and brain. And the physical reactions are part of this mechanistic physical system, which pays no attention to ideas or purposes or objectives. And so the thoughts, the mental content of these apes has no bearing whatsoever on what they do when a saber-toothed cat is approaching them. And more generally, all up and down the scale of life, the mental state of any creature has no effect on what physically the creature does. Now, I don't know if the microorganism has any mental experience at all, but if it does have a mental experience that says, oh, that way is where food is, that mental experience has no effect on the creature's movement. A bird catching a worm, well, maybe the bird has an idea of the worm, but that has no effect whatsoever. What is effective in affecting the worm's action is simply the physical state of its body and brain, which again operates according to this mechanistic causality, which pays no attention to the bird's desire to eat a worm or anything else in the bird's mind. But what this means is then that mental thoughts are invisible for natural selection. Natural selection can work only on the physical structure and behavior. Okay, so if the apes lack the physical strength to climb a tree and get away from the cat, well, natural selection is making life very hard and probably very short for those animals and so on. But natural selection doesn't care a lick about what's going on in their mind. And so natural selection has no bearing on conscious thought at any level, from the bacterium to the apes to humans. And so if natural selection does not operate on mental content, then mental content cannot evolve due to natural selection. And what this means is that this evolutionary epistemology, as featured by naturalism, gives no insight whatsoever into why we are able to have rational knowledge of the world around us. And if that's the case, then I think this defeats the naturalism that has that consequence. I mean, our ability to have rational knowledge of the world, that's an enormously important fact about us and about the world. And if you have a worldview that makes it impossible to explain why we have this knowledge and understanding, that worldview has basically nothing going for it. It's off the table. And I honestly, and I'm sure you'll have something to say about this, but I honestly believe that this is a defeater for this type of naturalism. So that's the argument.
Cool. So the way I understood that was essentially that consciousness and rationality, if naturalism is true, don't have a retroactive effect in the brain. They're essentially just something that is a result of the physical processes, but don't actually go back and do anything differently in the brain. So they don't serve any purpose. There's no benefit to them from an evolutionary standpoint. And so evolution wouldn't select for them. And that seemed to be the core of the argument. And my response would be something like, I would think that consciousness and rationality could be a simpler way to get a result out of the brain than, for example, doing it without consciousness. So if it's a more efficient way to get the physical states to result in running away, then that could be selected for over a purely non-conscious series of mechanistic states that would get the same result. So consciousness and rationality could be selected for by evolution if those processes were a more efficient way to cause the end results than purely mechanistic bacteria kind of things with no consciousness.
Okay, so the idea then is that consciousness might be a more efficient way to get a beneficial result, and then relying on non-conscious processes. Okay, for that to happen, the consciousness itself must make a difference in what's going on in the brain. Okay, I mean, you can't say that consciousness changes nothing about what's happening in the brain, and at the same time it gets a more efficient result. That's contradictory. For it to be more efficient, it has to make something happen in the brain that wouldn't be happening otherwise. And if that's so, then consciousness is making a difference, and you are giving up then on the causal closure of the physical domain, because consciousness is by definition something other than physical, and it's causing something to happen in the brain. So I don't have any problem with the idea that consciousness may lead to more efficient results, but consciousness doing that is inconsistent with naturalism as I've defined it. And I think it's inconsistent with naturalism as a great many philosophers who consider themselves naturalists understand naturalism to be.
Well, so two things. One would be is I think that consciousness is synonymous with the physical states in some sense. But if we just grant the argument that consciousness doesn't have any effect in the brain, it's just like a result, but doesn't actually go back and do anything. Even in that case, we could say that the physical states plus consciousness, even if consciousness does nothing, could still be simpler than getting the same results without the conscious. Kind of like a vestigial limb or vestigial arm. It's a thing that's a result that has some kind of effect that otherwise would take more pieces in the previous evolutionary example of whatever species you were with. So like if we have a butterfly, for example, butterflies as caterpillars have no sexual reproductive organs, so they can't reproduce whatsoever, but butterflies do once they evolve into a butterfly. So we can say that all of these extra things, the wings, the big tongue thingy, all of this stuff that happens when you metamorphosize from a caterpillar to a butterfly has lots of benefits. And there's some things that may not be as efficient as when you're in the caterpillar state, but the sum total of all of the parts of the butterfly is more efficient than the sum total of all of the parts of the caterpillar. And so the same thing can apply to conscious states. So having consciousness as a result that happens because of the brain state could still be simpler than a brain that doesn't have consciousness as a result. So the consciousness is as a byproduct like a vestigial limb, but it still is simpler than a non-conscious brain.
Well, it seems to me you're trying to have it both ways. I mean, on the one hand, you seem to be saying, okay, maybe the consciousness as such does not have any effect. Okay, well, maybe it doesn't. I mean, that's what I think a naturalist ought to say. But then you want to say having the consciousness somehow makes the whole thing work better. Now, you can't have it both ways. Either the consciousness itself has an effect or it doesn't. And,
right. I just want to clarify. So if you have a system that produces consciousness and a system that does not produce consciousness, say the system that produces consciousness takes 3 steps, but the system that doesn't produce consciousness takes 5 steps. If the consciousness producing state, which only takes 3 steps, is a simpler system than the one that takes 10 steps that does not produce consciousness, then evolution could select for the 3-step state that produces consciousness, because that's a total of 4 steps. You've got the 3 steps to do the result plus the consciousness. That's 4 steps. That's still less than the 10 steps of the thing that doesn't produce consciousness. And so even if consciousness is simply a byproduct that doesn't do anything, it could still be less steps than a different system that doesn't produce consciousness.
Well, certainly, I mean, some let's say brain systems are going to work better than others, and it could happen as a matter of chance that the system that is more efficient also happens to produce consciousness. That would not mean that consciousness is selected for. All it would mean is that it happens that that certain brain states are more efficient and are selected for, and it happens that those brain states, in some cases, are states that produce consciousness. But consciousness itself is not having any physical effect. Consciousness is still invisible to natural selection. Natural selection is not selecting for consciousness, and in particular, it's not selecting for rational consciousness. It's not selecting for consciousness that would involve a truthful understanding of the world. So that, it seems to me, that hasn't really gotten you anywhere.
Well, what would be the problem with that? So say evolution happened to select for the most efficient system, which happens to have consciousness and rationality as a part of it. That would still get us consciousness and rationality. So what would be the problem with that?
Well, if you're willing to rely on pure luck, okay, then then you've been lucky. All right, it's happened that you think it's happened that evolution happens to have picked out those physical states that have consciousness and rationality. It certainly hasn't, as far as rationality is concerned, evolution certainly hasn't picked out those states very reliably, because all of the thoughts that human beings have are the results of the brain states that were picked out by evolution. But as you know and I know, there are huge numbers of thoughts that are very far from human thoughts that are very far from being rational. There are sadly some individuals that give very little indication of rational thought aside from the most urgent day-to-day physical necessities.
Yes, like politicians, like all politicians.
Well, you may have a point. I mean, it seems very much that way these days. I agree, but it will be it will be purely a matter of luck if any of what we think are rational thoughts correspond at all to the way the world really is. I mean, if you think that poorly of, let's say, the whole body of modern science, I wonder why you would bother being a naturalist.
Well, I'm not sure I see the issue there. So like I would imagine, because evolution is based on luck, it's just random mutation. Some things happen. But the fact that random mutation created a rational conscious being, as some of the variations, and some of them are not, some of the evolutionary things are not conscious, like bacteria I don't think are conscious. I don't see that as a problem for the ones who are rational. Like if one subset species is the rational one that evolution created, it's no different from one subset having wings and a different subset not having wings. It's just a property that evolution created in some cases and not in other cases. Why would that be a problem for the worldview?
Well, you're relying on our, let's say, our naive assumption that we human beings are rational. But why would this be the case? We're saying that evolution, purely by chance, has picked out brain states, brain sequences that happen to be to give rise to rational thoughts. Now, the rational thoughts have no effect on what happens subsequently. They have no effect on the subsequent brain states. All we have is a series of mechanistic brain states that pay no attention to reasons, to purposes, anything of that sort. But these brain states are conducive to survival, and therefore they're picked out. But you're willing to put it down purely to luck that some of these brain states are rational, that some of them lead to a true understanding of the world. Why should we accept that? Why should that be the case? It's luck. It's pure luck.
I would say,
say that something's happened by pure luck is not to give a good explanation for it.
well, I think there are things that do happen by luck. And if there are things that do happen by luck, then to say that luck is the cause would be a rational explanation because that's what happened. But I think that it's not only luck. I think it's also necessity. I think that any consciousness that would be produced in reality would have to have properties of reality. So I don't think that any consciousness that is produced could imagine a round square. I don't think no matter how evolution wants to design your brain, it can never do it so that you can imagine a round square. It's not going to happen. It's never going to be able to make you believe you exist and be wrong. And so certain facts about rationality are going to be necessitated by the fact that if rationality is produced in the universe, in reality, then it must obey the same rational principles as reality. And so it will inherently have some rationality in it no matter what.
Now you're getting to the sort of thing that I think you need. Okay, the sort of thing to need to give an explanation for rationality. You're saying if rationality is produced within the universe, then it must follow the laws, rational laws of the universe. But that is an enormous assumption. You've just given yourself the birthday present of all birthday presents.
Wait, why is that an assumption?
What?
Why is that an assumption?
There's no reason why that has to be the case. We know that there are people who reason in ways that are not rational. We know there are people who can't reason at all, sadly. There's nothing, the fact that there is some kind of conscious state in no way guarantees that this is going to be rational in the way that we need it to be to account for our ability to know about the world. I mean, that's a huge leap that you have taken it upon yourself to assume. Okay, maybe that's true, but then we have to ask, why is that the case? Why would that be the case? And given naturalism, as we're talking about it, we have no reason why it would be the case.
Well, I would say that the reason would be like nothing in reality could violate the law of identity or the law of excluded middle or the law of non-contradiction. And so whatever our conscious states are, they're going to have to obey the law of identity. It has to A has to equal A. It can't not equal A doesn't equal B. It's not like a middle ground. So as long as our thoughts, both the rational and the irrational, all have to obey those laws, we can find certain rational patterns in all thoughts of all humans. Like I don't think any human can imagine a round square. I don't think that's possible. And so because evolution has to obey the laws in reality, there are certain rational laws that are going to necessarily be a part of every mind, whether it's entirely rational or mostly rational or partially rational. They will all innately have some rationality. And there's no way to eliminate all rationality from any consciousness because it has to obey the laws of logic. And if we ground our epistemology on those, if some of the consciousnesses ground their epistemology on these core rational beliefs, then we can gain a level of understanding of why rationality occurs in conscious agents, because they can't not have a pure or they can't have a perfectly irrational view. It's impossible for them to violate the law of identity with a conscious state. And so we must have some level of rationality in all brains.
So I think you're making a little jump here that I want to call attention to. Certainly, it's going to be true that our conscious states, that certain rational principles will be true of our conscious states. If Sally is thinking about ice cream, it won't be also true at the same moment that Sally is not thinking about ice cream, okay? But the fact that, if Sally's conscious state exists, it won't be true also that Sally's conscious state does not exist. But that's quite different from saying that Sally's thinking obeys rational principles. It may or may not. As a matter of fact, most people's thinking does obey rational principles, at least to some extent. But you're wanting to say that it's necessary. And I think that no ground has been given for that whatsoever. No basis has been given for saying that conscious states must conform to principles of rationality. And in fact, we know that many of them don't. So on the one hand, there's the fact that conscious states, okay, they exist in the world, and so principles of logic must be true of them. I can't be both thinking about ice cream and not thinking about ice cream. But is the thought process itself rational in the sense that it honors principles of rationality? There's no necessity. You haven't shown any necessity for that whatsoever. And natural selection does not give any necessity for that whatsoever. So I think there's that big gap between that principles of logic apply to the conscious states consisting as just the things that they are, or saying that the conscious states themselves follow principles of rationality, which they may or may not. That's completely up for grabs as far as I can see.
Right. So my argument would be something like, it's impossible for any conscious state to imagine a round square. It's impossible for any conscious state to do those kinds of things, imagine contradictory states. And so there's a limit to what rationality or what evolution can produce as rationality. It can't produce a round square imagining consciousness. And so because there's a limit to the spectrum of what kind of rationality evolution can produce, then it gives a direction to the way rationality will develop in a conscious state, because it can't produce everything.
Well, there may be some kinds of thoughts that are psychologically impossible, okay? And a round square might be an example, but you say that gives a direction. That does not give any direction. It just says there's a limitation. There may be physical limitations or some kind of limitations to how confused we can be. But that doesn't say that there's a direction of development that comes from that, or that you can explain human rationality because of that.
Well, why not? So if it eliminates certain kinds of possibilities, say on a spectrum, say there's a 360-degree circle, and evolution can produce anything on that circle, and you eliminate 15 degrees on the right, well, that means that necessarily the probability that it will develop in a different direction is significantly higher, since it can't do the 15 degrees on the right. Now the probability it goes on the left is higher. And so it seems like if there is a limit to what evolution can produce as rationality, then that means that it's more likely to go in one direction rather than the other, since it can't go in the other direction.
Well, it will go in some direction that is thoughts that are physically possible for the brain to produce, but that's all the thoughts that there are. The ones that the round square is not a thought. Is not something that anybody can imagine, but that gives you no direction. That doesn't give you Newton's theory of physics, or Garry Kasparov's ability to play chess, or none of those things will come from the less than meager starting point that you're claiming there.
Oh, well, sure, those would be long ending things after millions of years of evolution. But all I think I need is to show that at the very beginning of whatever consciousness may be, if at some point in the beginning of consciousness there's a reason to select, or a consequence to select, for some kind of rationality versus non-rationality, and that can be built upon and grow, it prioritizes a greater rationality than a lesser rationality. And that would
go ahead, sorry.
Oh yeah, so that would lead to the consequence of higher levels of rationality in certain cases, rather than pure irrationality. And so as long as we have that spectrum of here's some reason to prefer rationality over irrationality, and that grows, that would lead to Garry Kasparov and what we have today.
See, there's no, in your picture, there's no selection happening at all. There's just there's a limit to what is physically possible for a brain to produce. And let's say the limit that involves, you can't imagine a round square, okay. But there's no selection there. That's just what the brain, whatever the brain can produce is fine. And natural selection doesn't care whether it makes sense or not. Natural selection would be fine with a round square. It's just that the brain doesn't happen to be able to produce that. So you've got no selection going on at all.
Well, if it can't do it, wouldn't that, it's impossible to select for it if it can't do it. So isn't that a kind of selection, that since it can't pick this option, it has to go to a different option, which is possible. And so that it seems like it'd be a kind.
All you've got is what is possible for the brain, what the brain is capable of doing. There's no selection involved. It's just whatever the brain happens to shovel out in terms of conscious experience. There's no selection going on at all.
Well, right. So if it's only possible to be rational in some extent, then that makes it's not possible for it to select irrationality. It's not possible for it to choose that option, which means it must be in some minimal state rational.
See, you're talking about evolution choosing, which implies that evolution is selecting a favorite set of outcomes. But that's contradictory to the idea of the physical realm as autonomous and mechanistic. The physical realm doesn't pay attention to objectives. The physical realm doesn't select anything. The physical realm simply does its thing. Evolution no more selects than the rocks in an avalanche select where they're going to go.
Well, sure. So like if a evolution, whatever evolution is going to create or produce, if it must produce, say, red balls, then you're going to necessarily get red balls or starting red balls, and there's no possibility to get a non-red ball. And so in that case, if you ask, why do we have reason to believe that there are red balls? Well, if it's necessary, it can't not produce a red ball. Whether it chose it or not really doesn't make a difference. It's just it can't not get a red ball because of the laws of physics limit it to only be able to produce red balls. And so if I want to say, what is my explanation of the red balls, and I say, well, there's necessarily a red ball because it can't not produce a red ball, that seems like a sufficient explanation to get to having rationality in conscious agents.
Well, I think we seem to have reached an impasse at this point, because it seems to me that you're sneaking purpose and direction and so on back in where there's no justification for it. But it looks like we're just and if there's some way to get beyond it, that's fine. But it looks like we're just stuck at that point.
Well, sure. So I don't know. Are there any other arguments that you think are interesting? We have like 15 minutes left.
Well, one that I think has quite a lot of merit is the fine-tuning argument. It's widely agreed that among there are many fundamental constants of nature that are built into the physical structure of the universe. And what has developed in the last, maybe 30 or 40 years, is that many of these constants, these laws, are such that if they were very slightly different than they are, we would not have had a structured universe at all, or there would have been a universe in which biological life as we know it would be impossible. And it seems that there are, again, a large number of these. Now, I might say I'm not a specialist on this argument, so I don't have all the information in my own, but it's pretty well accepted that this is the case.
Oh yeah, so I totally agree that the fine tuning of the physical constants is like if we changed it to any degree, a life permitting universe wouldn't exist. But to me, the problem seems to be that God doesn't seem to solve the problem, because for every possible kind of a universe, there's a kind of a God who may want that universe. So say there's a universe, or God who only wants a universe full of puppies, or God who only wants a universe full of hydrogen atoms. So for each possible kind of way the universe could be, there's also a possible God who could want that universe. And so the spectrum of possible gods who could create a life permitting universe is exactly proportionally the same as the number of life permitting universes. And so you have the same fine tuning problem. Why is God so finely tuned of all the different spectrums of the way God could be, that he has this one particular nature that he would want a life permitting universe as opposed to a hydrogen only permitting universe? And so I don't see how that positing God as its solution doesn't seem to work. It just seems to kick the can down the road and have an equally as great fine-tuning problem, if not greater.
Oh, yeah, interesting. Where did you get all these gods from in the first place?
Logical possibility. I can imagine it being differently. It seems like the spectrum.
So why is that a problem? Of course, you can imagine all sorts of things. But the question, theists come to this with a conception of God, and they say that we ask that this conception of God can be tested against evidence. Well, what's the evidence? Well, we have the evidence is that there's a particular kind of universe which is really, on a basis of random probability, extremely improbable, but that is exactly what is needed for conscious beings like ourselves to exist. And the concept of God that we bring to this discussion is a God who is very interested in the existence of conscious beings, beings that are rational, beings that are capable of a relationship with God. And so, if there is such a God, then this God would create a universe which is life permitting, okay, which is conducive to the kind of life that he is interested in having in his universe. And in fact, so the likelihood of a life permitting universe, given the existence of God, is quite high, fairly high. Whereas if you don't have the hypothesis of the existence of God, the probability of a universe, life permitting universe, is extremely small. So the fact that such a universe exists is rather powerful evidence for the existence of this kind of God.
Well, it seems like I could say the same thing on naturalism. I could say that I have a hypothesis that all of the laws of physics are intertwined in such a way that any change to one will cause a proportional change to others. Therefore, the current combination of physics we have now is necessary, or the highest probable, highest most likely outcome, because I believe that there's this super law that ties all the laws together. And it seems like we could make any of those theories because we, of the anthropic principle, we start in a universe where there is conscious agents. And so we can automatically come up with a hypothesis that would entail conscious agents. But that doesn't seem to be evidence for the proposition, because we already started with this knowledge. It's knowledge we already had. And so we're post hoc explaining it. Like if we started with no universes and we want to say, have a hypothesis that there is a God that creates universes with conscious agents, and then we look and see, oh look, there's a universe with life permitting agents, yes, that would be great evidence. But since we already started with this knowledge, it's something that's post hoc. Like we don't know whether or not this is the only possible universe, whether or not it is highly likely. It seems like just adding in a way to explain the hypothesis doesn't actually count as evidence. Just like if I said, if we see a cup fall over and I say, I have a hypothesis that there's a magic leprechaun that knocks cups over, and we see, oh, look, there, the cup is knocked over. That wouldn't be evidence for the leprechaun, because I added in the leprechaun after we saw the cup fall over. It would only be evidence for the leprechaun if I could predict that the cup was going to fall over in the future, something we hadn't seen yet. But because we've already seen the data of the universe, it's post hoc to try to come up with an exclusionary principle to explain the data we already know about, which is why I don't think that's really evidence any more than the leprechaun in the cup case.
Well, Bayes' theorem and Bayesian epistemology does give us a way to reason on the basis of, quote, old evidence, things that we already know to be the case. If it turned out, what we did not know previously is that the universe is so finely balanced, finely tuned to make life possible. And it seemed, as likely as not that it's more or less inevitable that life would be at least possible in any universe that you could have. But given the evidence that only only a tiny infinitesimal fraction of possible universes are life permitting, then the fact that this universe is life permitting is strong evidence in favor of a hypothesis that explains why it is life permitting. Now, if you have, I admit, if you have a super theory, an actual super theory, which explains why all of the physical constants are fine-tuned in the right way, then that would be an alternative explanation. You don't have that. That's purely an imaginary construct. So we're not comparing an explanation with another explanation. We're comparing an explanation with pure guesswork. So it seems to me that that's not equivalent.
Well, how is it not pure guesswork to say there is a God who wants this versus it being pure guesswork that there is a unified field theory that does explain that all the laws are interconnected?
If you think that believers have come up with the idea of God on the basis of guesswork, you're just nowhere near understanding the situation. It's not true at all. It's just not true. We have a huge amount of experience, background that puts this forward as a strongly considered hypothesis independently of fine tuning. I'll grant you this. If the idea of God came up only as a result of the fine-tuning evidence, then that would be the sort of situation you're talking about. But that's not true at all. That's not true at all.
All right, I would expand it a little bit. I would say that if God came up as a God of the gaps, as that was the origin of the entire God hypothesis, was to explain unknowns, then any application of a God would be unjustified because if all of the arguments and evidence for God are essentially God of the gaps, then there's no prior evidence that would lend credence to God being a good explanation of the fine tuning. And so I would say that in this case, saying God created the universe would be synonymous with him only being created to explain the fine tuning, because I think that the hypothesis of a God was essentially created as a kind of God of the gaps. And I don't think any of the evidence or arguments actually work for a God, which is why, to me, it seems like the God hypothesis is synonymous with coming up with a leprechaun to explain the cup fell over. Suppose I forget, there's a specific disease where you see miniature people in psychology. Oliver Sacks did a lot of work on it. And suppose I had that disease and I see miniature people and then I see a cup fall over. I'm like, oh, a miniature person did that. If my grounding evidence for the existence of the miniature people comes from a psychological delusion of some kind, then I would not be rational to say that they actually exist and they actually knock the cup over. It would be more rational to say that the things that have an empirical basis, the wind, earthquakes, squirrels, those would all be better explanations for the cup falling over than to say the leprechauns did it. And I think the same thing applies to the fine tuning here. I think that the God hypothesis and the evidence for it seems to be better explained in every case by naturalism. Therefore, in the case of fine tuning, it's also better explained by naturalism, and to posit a God would be synonymous to positing a leprechaun of some case.
Well, if you think that theism is like positing a leprechaun, I think your understanding is so distorted that it's hard to see how we can make progress.
Well, what would be the difference?
But I I think going back to the subject we were talking about, I think that your naturalism has, for instance, has not explained rationality in any satisfactory way. So I don't, but the idea that God is introduced somehow as God of the gaps, well, I mean, your view of religion and religious people, it seems to me, is so distorted and inadequate that it's hard to make progress.
Well, could you explain to me the difference from God versus the leprechaun? Like from my perspective, it seems like all of the evidence for God is kind of like a God of the gaps. I don't see any of it working. And so if there's no
Well,
prior evidence, it seems synonymous. So what would be the difference in your view?
well, I don't. I mean, there's a, well, you might spend a few years reading up on, the Bible and if you like the Quran, some of the other, but the history of religions. Read William James on the varieties of religious experience. If you have a grasp on what religion is about, then the leprechaun thing will seem totally trivial and silly. And I can't give you those years of education that I'm not sure if you really are lacking them, but it would seem to when you try to make that comparison.
I'm not sure what you mean because I've done quite a bit of extensive research on the topic, but I don't see how the fact that more people have believed it in the past would make it a more plausible theory here. To me, I don't see what is the grounds that makes the God hypothesis more rational than the leprechaun hypothesis. Suppose we said that there was a culture of people who grew up believing in leprechauns, and leprechauns created the universe, and leprechauns make the waves in the water,
Yeah,
and et cetera, et cetera. How would that be any different from the God hypothesis?
yeah. I don't think this is a useful way to proceed. So I'll let that one go.
All right. Well, we've been going for about an hour. I really appreciate you coming on to have a conversation with me. Thank you again. And would you like to give any final statements, closing?
Me?
Yeah.
No, I'll let things stand.
All right.
All right.
Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I wish you have a wonderful day.
Same to you.
Talk to you later.